Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we are rolling along in this short series talking about the proverbial selves, air quotes, selves. We're talking about basically personality types and how it relates to all the aspects of self-esteem, self-confidence, self-trust. 2 episodes ago, we talked about personality types and self-awareness, how aware different personality types are. And we related it to you listening, and maybe you can gauge how aware you are in your life. And then last episode, we talked about certainty and uncertainty and how different personality types are attuned to different things in the world that they're more certain about or uncertain about. This week, we'll talk about self-esteem and how that relates to personality types.
Well, and how your personality type is going to impact how you are esteeming yourself. So when we did an overview, when we talked about personality types and self-awareness, we created a distinction between a lot of things it seems that people conflate together, like self-esteem, self-value, self-worth, self-trust, self-confidence. We think of these as all effectively the same thing. And if we have good self-worth, we're going to have good, self-confidence. And you and I posited that maybe these are slightly different things. And our ability to gain greater self-esteem and greater self-worth and greater self-confidence might be coming through different channels. And in fact, knowing what those channels are allows us to feel a sense of, I would say we have a greater growth mindset around it as opposed to a fixed mindset. Because I suspect that we tend to have somewhat of a fixed mindset around things like self-worth and self-esteem. We believe that we're at a certain place and it's like, well, that's just how it is. And I think we intuitively know that that's not true, that we can increase our, our overall sense of self. But what's our access point to it? How do we increase these things?
I have a quick question for you, historical question, just to see if you remember this. Do you remember when we were kids? You and I grew up in the 1980s. We were teenagers in the 1990s. There was a big push to help kids have more self-esteem. I remember this being like a concerted effort in like the culture at large. And I remember, quote unquote, the culture wanted to give kids positive messages to help build them self-esteem. Like tell them how good they are, encourage them. I think that's kind of where that whole trope of give everybody a trophy on the sports team, no matter if they won or not, so it builds their self-esteem. And I remember people in my life, like the adults in my life, were really pushing against that. They thought that was a bad idea. They thought that would actually have the opposite effect because they would argue that it was about doing something in the world for yourself, not just having praise heaped upon you. Do you remember this when you were a kid? Did you have this experience as well?
I remember the phenomena, but I think I'm a little too old to have benefited from it when I was young. Yeah, I think it came a little after me. You might have been more aware of it because you were more tapped into a younger culture. You and I are about a year apart.
Well, I had younger siblings. You have older siblings.
Exactly.
I worked at a teenage youth camp all my life. And so even in my 20s, I was focused on younger people.
Right. Exactly. And so you're probably a little bit more tapped into it. But I know what you're talking about. And I do think that there was a sense that it could be given, right? That's basically what you're saying is that there was an argument, a cultural argument of whether or not, this idea of self-esteem could be given, could be transferred from a parent to a child versus a child earning it effectively.
Yeah, I think that's what I remember.
Yeah.
And I was always surprised by because it made sense to me that positive messages would build self-esteem. And I think there is some truth to that. I do think you can create the guidelines through conversation and through encouragement. I consider myself an encourager in my life. I like to encourage my children and other people. Like, you can do it. You go for it. But I think they still have to take up the mantle and actually go for it.
Right. Well, I think we kind of touched on this in a couple podcasts ago. There's the societal messages we get from the outside. There's the things that we can borrow or we can integrate from the outside. But then there's the stuff that wells up from inside of ourselves. And it's a 1-2 punch, right? It's really hard, especially when you're a child. The younger you are, the more you are just slurping up messages like crazy, particularly from the people who you deem important, the people we are effectively, we're pre-wired to listen to those people and think that what they have to say to us is really important. our parents, teachers, mentors, older siblings, like anybody who has a voice in our lives that feels older than us. We're designed to just slurp that up like crazy because that's how we learn how the world works. And it is very difficult to have things emerge from inside of us if the messaging from the outside world is perpetually negative and derisive and undermining. It's like really hard to have something positive emerge from within. But it doesn't mean that if we get nothing but positive messages from the outside, that we will automatically have positive things emerging from within. There still is, there's a formula to some of this. And getting that positive messaging from the outside is one node in the system, but it's not the full formula, right? Like it's not all the nodes in the system.
Yeah. And
that's why those positive messages for some worked and for others did not. And that's why there was probably a lot of battles about it, because there were people looking at different parts of the system and going, this is the most important node. And other people would say, no, this is an important node. And the truth is that both of them and even more nodes are important, I think, in this. So when we talk about self-esteem in particular, because that's the topic of this podcast, the concept of self-esteem, and we mentioned before the need to get to the etymology of the word and how that influences, like why was self-esteem chosen to indicate this concept of how we feel about ourselves? And the word esteem is related to the word estimate. So to estimate something is to determine, to appraise it, to survey it effectively. And so self-esteem is basically our self-appraisal. It's our we determine our self-appraisal. So what are we doing when we're looking at how much we are appraising ourselves, we're esteeming ourselves? What's the formula for that piece? And so anytime you're looking at something that's being appraised, and I always think of a surveyor that's like appraising land, or effectively anything that is, being looked at to determine its worth and value. There's always a metric that is attempting to be hit, right? I'm looking at this thing, but not in a vacuum. I'm looking at it in comparison to other things like it, or I'm looking at it with this set of standards or metrics. And when we do that when we determine our own self-esteem, we're doing the exact same thing. We're trying to determine our worth and value based on a set of metrics. And so the most important thing that we can do is figure out, well, what are the metrics I'm using to determine my estimation, my personal appraisal of myself? And there's going to be a piece of it that is compare contrast with others that are like us, right? Because that's how appraisals work. We're looking at ourselves in relative value to other things like it. But there's also a need to make sure that we know what measurements we're using and make sure that the tools are calibrated, because all appraisal tools need to be calibrated over time. So we're going to tap into how our personality type influences our measurements, who and what we're comparing ourselves to, and it helps us keep our finger on the pulse of whether or not the instruments we're using to make these measurements are calibrated.
I made a distinction on a podcast or two ago when we were talking about this, because we're basically talking about all the selves, and we kind of just created almost like a table of contents of some of the things we're going to talk about in future episodes. And now here we are on the self-esteem table of contents chapter. And I made this distinction between self-esteem and self-worth. And the thing I mentioned a minute ago about the messages, the positive messages given to children, like when I was growing up and I'm watching this happen, I think was a message that was said it was a message of self-esteem, but I think it was a message of self-worth. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately got conflated with esteem. Like, you are worth something as a person just because who you are. That doesn't necessarily mean you get a trophy for not performing well. Mm-hmm. Because the estimation of who you are is about your performance. Your worth is just who you are. And we kind of made that distinction a little bit on that episode. Mm-hmm. And I used the example, and I'll say this again for you listening, like if you're trying to sell your house, like you have a physical piece of property in your house and you have an appraiser come, you want to sell this house and you want to list it for something, you have an appraiser come, they're going to appraise the worth of the house, like the actual material costs, like the walls and the wood and the shingles on the roof and the windows, all the material costs, the size of the land, like how much value is in that, like actual worth. But then the estimation also takes into account the relative value of that house, its location, how many of the nice properties or valued properties are around it. And then it really takes into account how much somebody's willing to pay for it. Because you might have something that's worth, quote unquote, a lot. Is that one Netflix show? Was it the Queen of Versailles or something where it talks about like the wealthiest dude like ever, or like one of the big wealthy guys like was building this big house for him and his wife. It's worth so much that they couldn't even really sell it very easily because it was worth so much, no one would pay for it.
Well, they couldn't finish it either. Like the cost of the materials in it was outrageous, and it just it ended up being like they had bought the materials, but they couldn't finish the house.
So it was worth so much, it wasn't even valued at anything. It was almost like its esteem was low because it was worth too much in a way. Anyway, that's near here. I'm off on a sidetrack. The point is that those two things are different.
Yeah.
That's the point, is that the worth and the value somebody would pay for a property are two separate things. And I think we conflate those, but it's important to realize what we're talking about when we talk about self-esteem. We're not talking about self-worth. We're not talking about you as a person listening right now. Oh, I'm only worth something if I do stuff in the world and I've got metrics to measure it. Oh no, like that's not at all it. You're a human being. You're a living creature. I would say even beyond humans, living life has worth and value inherently. We're talking about something on top of that.
Right. And in fact, actually, we'll spend a podcast talking about self-worth and self-value together based on effectively what you're discussing.
Yeah.
And that's why it's good to fillet some of these out, because there is a concept of intrinsic worth that should follow through all of this conversation. And so when we discuss things like value and esteem and confidence and trust, these are all going off on slightly different tangents or slightly different ways of looking at how we're, like how much can I rest into myself? How much do I think I give to the world, right? How much, what do I think I can get through? And really, what are the metrics I'm using to try to figure out sort of where I fit in all of this? Underneath all of that, if you believe in a preciousness of life at all, if you believe that the fact that there is living organic tissue that has consciousness and can reflect the universe back to itself, if you would all think that that's like a cool thing, then worth is intrinsic. Right? Because that's what we have. We have those capacities based on the fact that we exist, and that's worth something. So at the bottom of all of this is an assumption of worth. But regardless of whether or not we have a theoretical assumption of worth as living organic tissue that has consciousness and reflects the universe back to itself, there is still me, and what about where do I fit in all of it? And I think that's why things like self-esteem come in here, because I might have worth as a conscious creature, but there's billions of conscious creatures. So where do I fit in the sea of all of that? And I think that's where understanding how we are looking at things like esteem and value and trust and confidence personalizes that. It makes it more about where, like, my relative value in all of this.
So when I think about applying this to personality types, and we talked about this right before we started recording, we really make a distinction based on the aspects of our personality that perceive or learn things through our world. Like we perceive our world, we learn things, we're attuned to different things, versus the part of our personality that makes judgments or decisions or evaluative actions based on what we perceive. And I think one could say that self-esteem really is in the province of the judgments, the evaluative criteria that each of us as a personality type uses to both measure and make determinations on what to do with what we measure.
Yeah.
That seems to be, and so applying that measurement to the self, I would argue, is what self-esteem is.
Yeah. It's, an access point minimum.
Sure.
Is using our personality types judging functions to understand what our pre-wired estimations are probably going to use as metrics.
Yeah.
Meaning that our perceiving functions, so in type, when you look at your perceiving functions, your sensing or intuition, that probably, when it comes to the topic of self-esteem, indicates what things we're looking at. Like if you're a person who uses introverted sensing, or what we call memory, so this would be primarily SJ types, but NPs also use this. But if we're looking at it through the lens of introverted sensing or memory, let's say you were raised in an academic family. So a lot of your esteem, right, or your estimations, while they're going to be based on more on your judging functions, you're probably going to be thinking about it in the terms of an academic field or comparing yourself to what else is going on in academia, because that's what you're going to know. That's what you're going to be familiar with. Or if you're a person who uses a different perceiving function, it might be a completely different area of life. So the perceiving functions come in with what you're paying attention to. But I do think that our estimations, our surveys of ourselves are more focused on, or more influenced by rather, our judging function, our thinking or feeling criteria. So as we go through this concept of self-esteem, I think it's really good to maybe focus in on that and how personality types tend to judge things, how they tend to see things in terms of what's important. And like you said, and that also informs, the sort of the should statements of life, the shouldness of the world, and encourages us to take certain actions in order to be more in alignment with those judging functions. And I think that that's a really great access point to, even if it's not the whole story of self-esteem, it might be a good starting point to build more self-awareness around how we are esteeming ourselves.
Absolutely. If you're a new listener, or maybe you're a little unfamiliar with some of the terms we're using, judging functions, perceiving functions, all of these things, I recommend heading over to personalityhacker.com/car model. It's a little model we came up with, a metaphor we came up with to help you understand how your personality type has its cognitive functions prioritized. Basically, how your mind learns information and makes decisions. It's a great way to determine that for yourself, or get some understanding of how this shows up for you particularly. So I recommend going over again, personalityhacker.com/car model, and you can catch up as we talk about some of these deeper concepts.
Right. So we can dive into each of the types and look at it through the lens of these functions, these thinking and feeling functions. But I do want to make a nod or reference our previous podcast that also discussed our relationship to certainty. Because each personality type doesn't have just one judging function that they're using, which somebody like Dr. John Beebe would call egosyntonic, which basically means it's like a part of ourselves that we identify with. We actually have two judging functions that we identify with. One of them is a strength and is a place of certainty, and the other one is the opposite. It's a place of uncertainty. So when it comes to esteeming ourselves, we're going to have something that we will lean on, be influenced by, that will be almost like a refuge where we'll feel like we're doing well, but simultaneously we'll have something influencing us that undermines our sense of certainty. It will undermine our feelings of security. And both of those things need to be addressed in each type, I think. What's going to be something that we almost naturally look at and determine our value and worth with and go, yes, I'm winning. And the other one that goes, well, are you? And just kind of know that that's something that's going to hang there, and some of the advantages and disadvantages depending upon what that is. So let's start with the TJ types. Does that work?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So all the TJ types in the Myers-Briggs system, ENTJs, ESTJs, INTJs, and ISTJs, they are the most influenced by the judging functions of extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, and introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And extroverted thinking is basically taking thought and applying it to the outside world. It's usually seen, maybe the easiest way to understand it is resource management, making something happen, setting up progress and projects to continue down a road, and after progress has been made, create a beachhead, right? And then continue to make progress and then create a beachhead. It's forward movement in making things happen. And it has fairly simple criteria to determine whether or not something was good or bad. Did it work or didn't it work?
Yeah. And it's also linear and sequential. In other words, it's not happening random access. Like you said, it's building upon itself. It establishes and then moves forward.
Yeah, and it brings other people in and makes more and more complex things happen. And it's the function that you see the most in things like business and in government and anything that needs a sense of leadership and sort of how do we manage the world, right? How do we make things happen and manage things?
And it's a measurement function. Like, it's really focused on measurements and pass-fail criteria. I would argue it's the easiest one that we could talk about measuring things because it's focused on that. So it's probably the most accessible for measurements.
Hence why I started with it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's the major advantages, I would say that the major advantage that TJ types have, and one of the reasons why they come across so confident, is that the judging function, the decision-making function that they're primarily leaning on is the one that's most associated with measurements, metrics, and determining whether or not they passed or failed, right? Did I get it done? Did I make it happen? Did I succeed? Did I make progress? Yes. Awesome. I did it. Yay, I won, right? Or I'm doing it right. And so the major advantage that TJ types have, particularly when they're interfacing with the outside world, is that their esteem, their estimation, their surveyor tools are real tools of measurements. Like that's what it is intrinsically. And that's one of the reasons why TJ types have a tendency to lean on their own ability to make things happen and get things done because they've watched themselves do it over and over and over again. So that's a major advantage that TJs have when it comes to self-esteem. On the flip side, the other judging function or decision-making function they're leaning on is the exact opposite. It's introverted feeling or authenticity. And introverted feeling or authenticity does not work based on measurements. It works based on feelings, right? Does this feel right to me? Is this in alignment with who I see myself as, right? Is this a good thing for me to do? When I make these actions or do these things or think these thoughts or have these feelings, is this indicating that I am a good person, that I'm well motivated, that I'm being true and honest with myself? These are far less decisive criteria. These are way more abstract and opaque and kind of, sort of a little all over the place.
They're inner and subjective as well. So they're inside of the person. You can't necessarily display this outside of yourself. And because of that, you're the only one that can determine anything. No one else can really tell you, oh, you're out of alignment with yourself. Like you're the only person that can say that about yourself.
Exactly. And so while TJ types have the advantage of when they enter the outside world of having maybe the most easy to calibrate metrics of measurements of self-esteem, they simultaneously are being influenced by the least of all of those. And the place of certainty is in effectiveness, is in extroverted thinking, and the place of uncertainty is in introverted feeling or authenticity. So the most opaque of all of these also happens to be the place of the most uncertainty. So that advantage of confidence in the outside world is met with the disadvantage of insecurity when it comes to oneself.
I see a lot of TJs struggling right now, though, because our world is more digital, more social, and more emotional than ever. And I see a lot of TJs a little unmoored in what to do about that because they can't put it onto pass-fail criteria. The metrics are a little softer, a little bit softer edges, not as much definition. And I see a lot of TJs not necessarily knowing how to navigate that space. And so I think that uncertainty, if you're a TJ listening, you're one of those 4 types, I think that you probably are facing some uncertainty in this new world that's emerging. And hang in there. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but this can be a real challenge for you.
Yeah. What once was pretty obvious is now, well, I did it. I made it happen. It's like, yes, but did you make it happen the right way?
It's that idea of double bottom lines, right? It's like, It's not just about the numbers. It's also about what good are we doing and how satisfied are people in our organization or in the world. That double bottom line really throws off the TJ because they're not used to that, having a more softer bottom line they've got to account for.
Yeah. Did we all feel heard?
Yeah.
Was everybody respected in all of this, right? When we made it happen, but what are the implications? And it's not just the result, it's the process as well.
Yeah.
And so there is more uncertainty for this function than ever before. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to, there might be more hesitancy to navigate through the world and how, but as far as their esteem of themselves, did they get it done? Excellent, right? They got it done. And so we are talking about 2 different fronts. We are talking about the feedback we get from the outside world and how that influences us, but we're also talking about the thing that emerges from within, from inside of us. And if for a TJ type, the number one thing they're looking at is pass-fail criteria and making things happen and being effective in the world, then from within, they are probably going to give themselves a pat on the head every time they succeed, every time they get it done.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's a major advantage. On the flip side, the other thing that's influencing them is something that is a lot less certain. It's a lot less, it has far fewer definitions. And it's more related not to how what happened and whether or not you got something done. It's more related to the quality you are as a human being. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good or a bad person? What does it mean to have conscience? What does it mean to be in alignment with yourself and be well motivated and have good intentions, or just to understand your intentions at all? So in a place where they're determining their esteem or estimation of themselves based on this criteria, there's going to be a lot of hesitation, and there might be a tendency or a desire to want to oversimplify it. And that becomes the Achilles heel. The Achilles heel is, I'm not going to look at it, or I'm going to be consumed with the question, right? Or I'm going to oversimplify all of it so that when I look at this thing, it's real black and white. Like, am I as unchanging as the tide, right? Am I a person who does not alter who I am at all? That might be what is defined as being a good person, when really it's just being a simple identity in order to not have to manage all the complexity of what it means to be a person with a variety of experiences. And so that estimation of self might end up being oversimplified. And through its oversimplification, that all by itself creates a lack of alignment. Mm-hmm. Because nobody is that simple. Everybody is complex. So when we're talking about be aware of the measurements you're using, be aware of your tools and whether or not they're calibrated. When a TJ type gets undermined by their own concept of identity, when they try to simplify it through things like what's called role person merger, which is merging who you believe you are with the thing you're doing in the world. Like, I'm a professor is role person merger, right? Like, I'm defining myself by my professorship, or I'm defining myself by whatever my career position is. When a person does that, there's a bunch of other parts of themselves going, yeah, but we're in here too. And we need some representation. We need you to pay attention to us. We need you to hear all the elements of who you are. And if a TJ type refuses to look at all of that because it's too complex or they're afraid of what they'll see in there, then the thing that is eroding their self-esteem is doing it from the shadows, right? It's just kind of leaching their self-esteem into a place they can't even see where it's going. And so calibration doesn't necessarily mean you have to become obsessed with identity or just do that all the time. But paying attention to that and having an awareness of what is ultimately robbing that sense of self and go, oh, it might be this part of who I am. And it's because I can't get my finger on it. I'm so used to being able to just define this clearly and know what it is based on the result I got. I'm so used to that. How do I even contend with this part of who I am that feels like it's ever changing and doesn't have anything that I can really point to, and it has no definition or defined end game? Calibrating that part of who, or having calibrated instruments, means just being aware of the nature of the instrument at all.
Yeah.
Right. There is nothing definitive here. It's just knowing, it's just getting to know yourself. It's being in touch with your emotions. It's being in touch with the things that are truly motivating you and your intentions. It's having a finger on the pulse of all of that and giving it some space to express, not necessarily pinning it down and requiring it to be anything, but to just allow it to be and get in touch with that and know that this is a place that every once in a while you're going to feel uncertain about, right? You're going to go, am I really a good person? Am I doing good things? Am I just kind of being a selfish, sort of despot that's out for myself? And every once in a while, feeling that way doesn't mean that that's true. It means it's a question, and you might want to listen to it and check in and go, no, I actually think I have other instincts in there too. I have other intentions and motivations. I want to do good things, and I want to make sure that people are happy in my life, and I care about people. And so then being able to have that internal conversation means not having your self-esteem eroded by hearing that question and then just pushing it away and going like, no, I'm not even going to listen to it. And now that question is hanging there. And now it's causing even more doubt. And now you're throwing everything into making things happen in the outside world as this part of you in the background gets more and more uncertain and more insecure. And because it's got to be the 1-2 punch. It's got to be both of it. It's got to be both a sense of self-esteem that comes from your personhood and a sense of esteem that comes from what you are accomplishing in the outside world.
So you mentioned that every personality type has a strength in this and a little bit of a weakness or a challenge. And so for TJs, it's the strength is effectiveness, extroverted thinking, measuring pass-fail criteria. The challenge is that introverted feeling, authenticity of the personal resonance, core value alignment. If we flip over to the FP types, that dynamic flips. So they're still using those same two judging functions of effectiveness and authenticity, extroverted thinking, and introverted feeling in the reverse order. So these are ENFPs, ESFPs, INFPs, and ISFPs that are using authenticity to make their decisions. Introverted feeling, what's in alignment, what's resonant to me as a person, and that's how all FP types are moving through the world. But there's that challenge that's in the back of the mind, the back seat of the car model that we talk about, that's always saying, yeah, but you've got to measure it. You've got to have a pass-fail criteria. And there's a lot of uncertainty when that enters the frame. Like when that comes into the field, it's like, am I doing enough to justify me being a good person that I feel that I am? Or, yeah, these things are in alignment, but there's that little voice that's nagging that can undermine our self-esteem, often as people, when you're an FP type, and you don't feel like you're doing enough, or maybe you don't feel good about yourself because you may not have things to quote unquote show for it from that effectiveness process.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, what a nice advantage as an FP type to be able to have your highest sense of certainty in the most abstract element of all of this, which is who you are as a person, right? Have your highest degree. Now, that doesn't mean that, and there's going to be, I'm sure, some FP types that push back and go, no, I'm very uncertain or insecure, but usually not in being unaware of their intentions and motivations and desires, right? Like being able to see the dark parts of the human spirit and the human soul without that immediately throwing person into an existential crisis, which happens to a lot of other types. You know, the other types go and look at the whole experience of being human and see all of it and all of the, you know, understanding that everything is motivated by a cocktail of motivations and intentions and seeing the good and the bad. For people who use introverted feeling or authenticity as a strength, that's what they do, right? Like that's their field, that's their playground. And so while it's not always pretty, they're not necessarily like their humanness is not undermined by being able to see that. Now, other things might in the outside world might be causing them pain, or they might deal with pain, but there's also a much higher threshold to be able to tolerate emotional pain, which is why sometimes an FP type can get lost there because their ability to hang there is much higher than other types. And so it's like having a high threshold for physical pain, and then you see those people do a bunch of extreme sports and get hurt all the time, right? It's like when you have a high threshold for something, you end up putting yourself in a position to be able to feel that more. And so for FP types, one of the nice advantages is that in the part of ourselves that causes most other types like a lot of insecurity, right? Oh, I have darkness in me. Does that mean I'm automatically a bad person? For FP types, they can kind of hang there and they can see that. In fact, they want to see other people be willing to express those parts of who they are because they know that that's true and honest. They know that that's authentic. So that's a major advantage that FP types have, is that their primary estimation appraisal instrument is one that has the least amount of definition, but for them, the highest amount of certainty.
And I think that FP types struggle the most with this idea of a spider bite mentality. So we've talked about on past episodes, there's a difference between Spider-Man and Batman. Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider and became a superhero without really doing anything. Like he didn't have to go train. He just got it. Where Batman had to make choices and go train and put discipline in to become Batman. And I think introverted feeling authenticity is the most of all the type, like of all the judging functions, I think it lends itself most to spider bite mentality. Either I was granted this as who I am, or I wasn't. Full stop. I was born with talents and skills and wiring and everything in my biography of who I am, or I wasn't. And that's just how it is. It's like a fatalism almost. And if I have talents or skills, that's just because of who I am. It's not the things I've done in the world. And I think that in that lies a real danger, because it means that I might, I'm an ENFP, right? That's my type preferences. So I really identify with that struggle. And it means that the FP person, the type that uses authenticity or introverted feeling, may not build self-esteem in certain areas if they don't believe it's their inherent quality or value. So I think the way that this can show up for introverted feeling is you just stop yourself short of going out and building the competency, not for everybody and not all the time, but some introverted feeling authenticity users, I think, struggle with this. And they say, well, that's not in the cards for me. I wasn't born that way with that talent or skill. So that's not me. And I think that can undermine a sense of self as well.
Yeah. Well, and so you're actually speaking to the other side, the place of uncertainty, which would be extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which we just mentioned is a matter of making measured progress and then creating beachheads.
Yeah.
Right. It's progress over time. Nothing is intrinsic to extroverted thinking or effectiveness. It all has to be built. And so this idea of going for the things you want and then building them over time and rallying the troops and getting the resources together and making it happen, on a timeline, like you mentioned, a linear timeline. Well, if that's a place of uncertainty for you, your ability to do that, then that's where the insecurity is going to lie. That's where the lack of self-esteem is most likely going to live, is this idea of, can I build something? Can I make measured progress over time? Can I establish something and create a beachhead and then continue to create more beachheads over time?
From an authenticity perspective, I want to add more nuance to that, in that, yes, you're right. That is one level of it. I think there's a level deeper in that. Like, I've been watching a lot of biographies about Jerry Garcia and how much he was practicing his guitar. Like, he would do guitar riffs. He'd watch TV every night and just play scales while he's watching TV. Like, he would practice constantly. And you could say, well, he built the skill, so of course. But something in my authenticity tells me, well, but he was already pre-wired that way. So I'm never going to be, if I picked up the guitar, he probably had something in his character or his aptitude that made him one of the most popular guitarists of his generation, because he was probably born with some of the raw talent. Like, I explain away my lack of self-esteem towards something like that, for example, based on my ego excuses it and says, well, he's probably born that way. Do you understand what I'm saying by that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think you're right. There is competency to be built, but even when I see examples of it I suspect I'm not going to get the argument with it, but he's probably an introverted feeling authenticity user. I even see an example of an authenticity user going for something they want and practicing it and building the skill. And I still, as an authenticity person myself, find myself excusing it away that it couldn't apply to me for some reason. That's the layer that I want to speak to you. If you're a FP type, if you're using authenticity, watch out for this, because I think this can hijack you building self-esteem in your life.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to the center point of introverted feeling or authenticity, like, you're talking about building a skill, but that's different than the intrinsicness of who I am as a human.
Correct.
And so introverted feeling or authenticity users usually have a sense of self that's pretty strong.
Self-worth.
Yeah.
A sense of self-worth.
Yes. Well, and oftentimes I'll hear FP type say things like, why do I have to prove myself to the outside world? Like, why can't I just have worth with just being a person and having a human experience? And the questions never come from within. They're always insinuated by responses they get from the outside world, which is, no, you also have to do something.
Yeah.
It's like, well, why do I have to do something? Why can't I just be a person who has value? And what you're talking about is the skill development, right? The evidence of a person's talents or skills or whatever. Like, it's the interfacing with the outside world, and the outside world going, oh, you just did a good job, which is what extroverted thinking or effectiveness is always looking for, right? Did I pass or fail? Did I do a good job? What are my gains? Like, what are the metrics I'm using here? Oh, I'm using approval. Did I get it? Or am I using how much money I was able to generate? Did I get it? Was I able to climb up the corporate ladder? Was I able to, get the goal? Was I able to complete the project? For extroverted thinking or effectiveness, if there isn't a specific metric or goal, they'll invent one. They'll make one so they can continue progressing towards it. And for introverted feeling or authenticity, like that, or the people who use that as a strength, that's their sense of uncertainty. Well, I completed the project maybe. Well, did I do a good enough job? Right? Like it was pass. I did pass and not fail. Was that good enough? Did I prove my worth and value to the outside world? Should I build self-esteem on that? The idea of building self-esteem based on what you do in the outside world is confusing to an FP type usually. And yet that is going to erode them if they haven't done that. They haven't taken the action to have demonstrated value.
Yeah.
And just like the TJ type might have questions about whether or not they have intrinsic worth, whether or not they're a good or bad person. And if they don't want to ask themselves that question because it makes them feel insecure, they'll push it to the side and it will just sort of leach their self-esteem from them into the shadow. It's the same thing with the FP type that denies that there's a part of them that wants to have demonstrated value. And so they'll go, well, that's stupid. I don't have to have a career or job or whatever to demonstrate value. I don't have to do anything. It's the same thing as them shoving it into the shadows and then that just leaching their sense of self-esteem into a place they don't even see because they have set it over here.
So that's the extroverted thinking effectiveness and introverted feeling authenticity types, TJs and FPs. Let's talk about the other two personality type clusters of judging functions. So let's talk about extroverted feeling or harmony. This is used by all FJs in the Myers-Briggs system. So ENFJs, INFJs, ESFJs, ISFJs. And this is about getting people's needs met. This is about what keeps harmony in a group. This is about the dynamics between people, the vibe, the emotional energy out here in the world. And it's an amazing function that really helps people get along and understand each other and connect and have fun. And it really is the glue that holds our society together.
Yeah. And so the place of certainty for FJ types is going to be in extroverted feeling or harmony. And that is using as one's surveyor tool of estimation or esteem, connectedness, the health of one's relationships, being tapped into the culture at large, understanding what is happening on a social level. So writ small, it's the connections between individual human beings, right? It's relationships. Writ large, it's a tapping into society and what's happening on a much grander level, right? Where is society going? And this is definitely an energy that is coming up in the world. You know, I've said multiple times, I don't know if I've said it on the podcast, but it feels like the 20th century was very much an extroverted thinking or effectiveness century. This century, this 21st century feels like it's going to be more of an extroverted feeling or harmony century.
Yeah.
And so it feels like this energy is definitely coming up.
Well, I think that's where the double bottom line comes from. It's not just about getting the bridge built. It's about everybody on the team that built the bridge feeling great about it.
Exactly. Yep. And so when FJ types are determining their own self-esteem, the estimation of themselves, the place of the greatest certainty, the first measuring rod they're going to use is the quality of their relationships and their connectedness with other people. Whether or not they have friendships and relationships, whether or not they feel like they're very much connected to a culture at large, that they're contributing, that they're part of this, sort of bigger picture of humans going a certain direction. And so if you're using your relationships as your first measurement, like extroverted thinking or effectiveness, this makes it a little more convenient because you're looking at outer world markers to determine whether or not you're succeeding. What are the quality of my relationships? How connected am I? How much am I giving to the group or to my community or society at large? Like what am I offering of myself? And like you mentioned, it's getting people's needs met, but that could be, it could be your family, it could be your partner, it could be people in your life, or it could be the needs of humans, right? What am I doing to be a part of, to be a bigger part of contribution? So when an FJ type is feeling low, this is where you get a lot of the recommendations that when you feel depressed, go help somebody else. Because this is the part of us that lights up when we do that, right? This is the part of us that goes, okay, it's going to be okay. I have people I can lean on. I have people who can lean on me. Well, we've all got each other's backs. It's going to be okay. And so that's the advantage to it. The advantage is that while it doesn't have as specific, measurable criteria as extroverted thinking or effectiveness, it does have more of an objectiveness to it. It has more of you can observe this in the outside world. If I am connected, if I have friends and relationships and people I love and who love me, I'm probably doing okay.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I would say there is a little bit of a difference in how some extroverted feeling or harmony people see that metric or that judgment, that metric, however you want to say it. And I think this might be something that causes a little bit of low self-esteem. Some harmony users, FJ types, are so focused on getting the needs met at such a distant future, like being on the right side of history. I think that's a very extroverted feeling metric because it's like about social, right? I want to be on the right social group in the future. And there's almost an attunement to that so much that they feel unsatisfied in the here and now of what's going on right now in the world. Like they're so focused on, doing things to go toward that metric. I think it makes them feel really unsatisfied and not have good self-esteem sometimes. Really struggle with, am I doing the right thing? Do I have a good self-esteem? Am I showing up and contributing well? Society tells me I need to be focused on that future point. But really, I think extroverted feeling or harmony is attuned to the here and now. It's responsive to the moment, the needs right now. Because it's going to be really hard to know what the needs are 100 years from now. We could guess.
Yeah.
But I think that undermines a little bit of what extroverted feeling shows up to give.
Well, and I would actually argue the phenomenon you're talking about is not extroverted feeling. It's the opposite side. It's introverted thinking or accuracy.
There you go.
So that's going to be a place, that's going to be the other judging function that influences FJs, but is not going to be a place of certainty. So introverted thinking is more about core principles. It's more about a detached judgment, right? Whenever you're in an introverted thinking or accuracy space, you're actually detaching from a situation and you're trying to look at it as logically and objectively as possible without your own personal bias in it. And when a person is attempting to be as logical as possible, what ends up happening is they end up reducing things down to core principles. And core principles are timeless. That's sort of the point, right? They're the things that continue and hold true regardless of context. And so if you're looking at your sort of the thing you're contributing to society, but it has to be approved of on every moment in the timeline, now we're actually talking about a core principle. What is a core principle of how we should be treating each other? What's a core principle of how we should be showing up and judging? What merit should we be judging each other upon in a timeless way? And so that undermining that like sort of hyper focus on doing things that 100 years from now will approve of your actions, you'll be on the right side of history, is more tapping into this concept of a core principle.
Yeah.
And that is introverted thinking or accuracy, which is going to be the place where there is less certainty.
So at the sake of sounding dumb or ignorant here, this is an idea came up. Could we say a past version of this, low level? This is something I heard my grandmother talk about. She was an FJ type, she's an ISFJ. She had a core principle of never wear white after Labor Day. And I was like, that's weird, but it was like a social core principle that was supposed to guide people into the future. So you knew what to do. You kind of had a metric of how society expected you. I just want to make sure that idea that jumped in my head is landing to where you're trying to go with what you're saying.
Well, I wouldn't call it a core principle that introverted thinking or accuracy users themselves would say is a core principle.
Of course, but FJs might.
Yeah, well, it would become a social rule.
Yeah.
Right. And oftentimes, I mean, that one is a spoken one, but a lot of times extroverted feeling or harmony adopts social rules and does conflate them as core principles. Yes.
But when my grandmother said that, she was growing up, World War II generation. In the 1940s, that probably gave her the feeling like, as long as you abide by that, you'll be on the right side of history in the future. Like her and all, like the culture that was in that time period probably thought like, it's going to always be this way. Like it's kind of like a core principle of culture, but culture shifts, and those principles that support culture shift based on the expectations. I think that's my point in saying this.
Possibly. I think we're getting into perceiving function territory just a little bit.
I agree.
Because I don't know if people in the past were as focused on the right side of history, because there's a future pacing that comes in here. And I think the future pacing isn't just, I mean, I was likening it or sort of relating it back to the core principle of introverted thinking, or accuracy, which is it's going to hold true no matter what the context is. But I think that focus on specifically the future and being on the right side of history according to future judgments is more related to introverted intuition or perspectives, which run simulations into the future of how the future is going to pan out.
Of course.
And particularly when you're marrying it with extroverted feeling or harmony, that's going to be what is society going to think or believe, or what's going to be their values in the future. And I want to make sure that I'm also in alignment with that. As I mentioned at the beginning, which perceiving function you're using is going to determine some of this as well. Like introverted sensing or memory. If your family is full of academics, then you're going to be looking to academia to be the world in which you're trying to get your other judging functions manifest, right? If you're introverted sensing memory with effectiveness, it's like, and academia is your family's, sort of like that's what they've been doing forever. Like you're filled with academics. It's going to be like, well, did I get my professorship, or did I get my tenure, or did I get whatever? Like, was I able to make that metric? If it's more harmony, is it like, well, do I fit into the culture of academics in my family? Can I show up with that role and be part of that and be a part of the connectedness of a family of scholars? Looking to the future and saying wanting to be on the right side of future is more of like anybody who's using introverted intuition or perspectives.
Of course.
You're right. They're going to go, well, I don't just want to be a contributor to society. I want to be a contributor to society that is moving us toward a specific future. And so I think there's going to be a little bit of that colored in there as well.
I didn't mean to hijack us, so throw us off on a tangent. We can come back to the main, what you were talking about. I appreciate you playing with me in this.
Yeah.
Let's come back to it though. So we were talking about the thing that can undermine extroverted feeling or harmony, potentially, feeling a sense of self-esteem, is that little persnickety. I would argue it's supposed to be a calibrated voice, but a lot of FJ users, harmony, extroverted feeling users, hear it as a critical voice.
Yes. Yeah. So
not calibrative.
Right. Exactly. So introverted thinking or accuracy, again, is a detachment from self. Like that's part of its core. Like that's what it does, is it tries to detach from self. And which actually is one of the biggest differences between it and say introverted feeling or authenticity, which attaches to self. It's like very much, it's associated with self. Introverted thinking disassociates from self. And so because of that, when it disassociates, it looks at the situation with a critical eye, and it's trying to find the truth of something.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how I feel about that. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the truth. And that's why core principles are so valuable, because most truths aren't truths. They're just perspectives. Most things that people believe are not facts. They're just ways of interpreting the world, right? They're not actually provable, logically consistent concepts. They're just the thought we had and we believed it when we thought it. So because of that, introverted thinking takes a step back, accuracy takes a step back, and then it looks with a critical eye at what's going on inside the mind. What's the coding? What are my thoughts? What are my beliefs? What are the things I'm thinking? I heard a person with ENTP preferences try to explain to their team, because they were in a position of leadership. They're like, listen, there's a difference between what you believe and what you think and what you know. And he was like trying to explain all these three things. what you believe and what you think and what you know are not all the same, right? Just because you believe it doesn't mean you know it, right? Just because you think it doesn't mean you believe it, right? Like he was trying to create this distinction of all these things. And introverted thinking is almost always trying to take a step back and go, okay, so what is knowable? What is true? What is something that I can actually noodle out? And what's a mystery of the world that's just hangs as a mystery of the world? And that's why core principles become so important, because they're the irreducible, logically congruent, consistent facts that don't change regardless of what you want and moment in time. So it is a critical I. But when it is in a position of uncertainty, it feels like it is criticizing the self, which is part of what it does, by the way. It does criticize the self because it's trying to ameliorate the self. It's trying to encourage the self to be a better version.
Yeah.
If we can gain in competence, why wouldn't we? Let's be more competent. Let's be more capable. Let's be a better version of this. How do we improve all the time? As opposed to taking this thinking and putting it into the outside world, which is what extroverted thinking or effectiveness does by going like, okay, let's get 5% better and create a beachhead. Let's continue to make progress in the outside world. Introverted thinking is taking that thought and bringing it in-house. How do I improve the self? 5% every day, create a beachhead, right? How can I continue to build in my skills? Which is why competence becomes so important. So if you have this as a place of uncertainty, it just sounds like you're constantly criticizing yourself, right? You're not doing good enough. You should be better. You're not competent enough. You're not smart enough. You're not capable enough. You don't know enough, right? And so now this is a place that is really undermining self-esteem. You can have great relationships in the outside world if you're an FJ type. You can have all these people who love you and rely on you and you rely on them, and you have a beautiful tribe of human beings you're connected to.
Yeah.
And then you've got this voice inside that goes, yeah, but that thing you said like 2 weeks ago to that one person, you shouldn't have said that. That was a terrible thing to say. And you probably hurt their feelings. You should have done better, right? And this idea of, we should all be doing better. It's such a vague concept. I remember reading a while back on social media, somebody's post was just, I invite you to do better. And I was like, can you give me some details or like an area or like anything specific, or do I just generally have to be a better human being, right? So this idea of like inviting each other to do better has just enough of a thought of improvement, but without any specifics at all. So it's a very undermining concept, right? Oh, you're just saying like it's all of me, like the whole thing is just a problem, right? I invite you, all of you, 100% of you to do better. And it's like, yeah, well, I invite myself to do that every day. It's called an insistent mean girl voice, and it's actually killing me, and I kind of hate myself and everybody else.
Yeah.
So it can become a very critical inner voice because it's a place of why am I thinking this? Is it because it's true? Am I a terrible person? Am I stupid? I don't know. I don't have my facts straight. I am not logical enough. Like, what's really going on here? And the further down it goes in certainty, the worse it gets. So just like the TJ types can go, can they have this question in their mind of like, am I a good person? Am I well-intended? Am I doing the right things? And they just go, I don't want to hear that. I'm going to put it over here. FJ types can do the same thing with introverted thinking or accuracy, right? It's like maybe you're not being maybe you shouldn't be thinking everything you think or believing everything you think. Maybe you're not being logical enough. Maybe you don't know enough on this topic. Maybe you don't have your ducks in a row, right? Maybe you're not as smart as you think you are, right? And it's just like I can either get obsessed with that and that undermines my self-confidence or self-esteem rather, or I can just shove that thought over here, right? And just not look at it and not think about it. And every once in a while I'll go off on a little spiel about my opinions of the world. And then later on, I'll beat myself up for saying a whole bunch of stuff that I may or may not have been thinking is true. I was just getting off my chest. And now my self-esteem is being leached into the shadow by this big question of whether or not I'm good enough.
So I want to stop you for a second and just ask for some clarity. Because you have the two judging functions of extroverted feeling or harmony, Antonia, as in type preference, ENTP. I don't have these two functions. So I have them in my shadow, but I don't have them directly in my conscious awareness all the time. What it could sound to me like what you're saying is, like, as I'm patterning everything you're saying, I'm weaving it together, that an extroverted feeling person, an FJ, using harmony, is getting their self-esteem. That critical voice, if you put it aside, you're really getting your self-esteem based on your connections and your relationships and who you're associated with. And I think I brought up the core principle of never wear white past Labor Day as an example, because I'm from my perspective as an ENFP, looking at an FJ person using harmony or extroverted feeling, it seems like they're either going to be out of compliance with the group and not have self-esteem. If their self-esteem is based on other people, and that rule or that principle changes, like now we can wear white past Labor Day, but I still maintain that. Now I'm out of connection with the group if I could do my own thing as an FJ user. And I'm no longer, now my self-esteem is plummeted because I'm out of lockstep with the group. Or I contort myself to the group to stay in good self-esteem, but maybe they're not my core principles. I'm just doing it because the group wants me to. So either way, from my perspective, and I'm being a little funny when I say, I probably can pattern what you're going to say, but I'm just teeing you up to maybe give some perspective on this based on what you said, because from my perspective, not as an FJ, those are the two ways I would see it. And it looks, again, from my viewpoint, that's very, it doesn't have foundation. You're at the mercy of other people.
Yeah. And I think you've also asked before, like, well, isn't that like shifting sand all the time? Like,
it feels like it's shifting constantly.
Right. So to get more clear on the tool. So again, we're going back to what metric, what measurement, what tool am I using to feel a sense of esteem and worth, right? How am I appraising myself? And so for FJs, the stronger tool, the more certain tool is extroverted feeling or harmony. And there are certain things that come along with this. I would say that most of the time that estimation comes from things like, have I been able to help keep morale up? Have I had a positive impact on this group of people? When I enter a room, are they happy to see me because I'm giving to this group? It's like it's almost the same sense of progress that extroverted thinking or effectiveness feels, but instead of building something physical, it's more pouring into people and relationships. So have I been a form of glue and connectedness? Have I helped other people reconcile their relationships, right? Like if two people are fighting, was I able to help them come to a sense of harmony through conflict? Have I been able to pour into my children and raise them to be compassionate people? Have I been able to positively influence society around me in some way? So I did say writ small, it's personal relationships, and writ large, it's a sense of, culture or society. But you're still, even if you're doing it primarily through your family relationships, you're still pouring into sort of the matrix of humanness.
Yeah.
And society is one big matrix of interpersonal dynamics. And there's a lot of toxicity in there. And there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of people who are struggling. There's a lot of needs going unmet. And was I a person who was able to pour into this matrix of humanity in a positive way?
I'm glad you said this, because that resonates more with me, because it's still an assessment of the self and what you're doing to contribute and feed into the system, rather than the group assessment of you. And I think that's a nuance. The reason I asked all of that and teed you up is I think that distinction is important for FJ types, for harmony users, extroverted feeling, because I think they can conflate, just like introverted feeling can conflate worth and self-esteem sometimes, because they don't have that metric of extroverted thinking right there readily available. It's more in the background. I think extroverted feeling can do the same between the group telling me that I've got good self-esteem and me knowing that I've contributed into the group from my sense, my perspective of what I've done. And so I think that nuance is important.
Yeah, well, and I mean, maybe this goes back to, and I think I've mentioned it, but I said it in kind of an abstract way, making sure our tools are calibrated.
Yeah.
Right? Because every surveyor, when they use instruments to measure things, like if you've got a GPS system that you're using to survey a plot of land, you have to make sure your GPS system is calibrated, right?
Yeah.
And so all of these, we're saying them as if they're well calibrated and healthy. But if extroverted thinking or effectiveness starts to build self-esteem just on its ability to, say, maybe generate resource, then it's not a very well calibrated tool, because it might be able to generate resource at the cost of everybody else and take and consume and make progress in its own maybe career trajectory while stepping on everyone else on the way up, or maybe destroying something over here in order to build over here. That is not a well-calibrated effectiveness tool, right? It's still a tool, it's still measurement, but it's not well-calibrated. And so a person might just look at that little slice of the thing they were able to create, But then all of the damage that's done on the side, they're not taking into account consciously, but yet that is still going to pour into it. And that's going to undermine their self-esteem, because actually it's not a well-calibrated tool. And so it's giving off faulty reads. Same thing with introverted feeling, right? Or authenticity. If it's only looking at the dark parts of humanity and it's ignoring all the positive stuff, right? This is almost like a martyr version of introverted feeling or authenticity. It's almost getting consumed by its own humbleness in a way, right? It's like it's almost a false front of humility, or like I'm not a person of high ego because I'll own all of my faults. It's like
I care too much.
Yeah, and it's like, well, but are you also looking at all the positive stuff, and are you looking at the entire spectrum of it, and are you really kind of tapped into sort of the humanness of it all, or are you picking and choosing? Like, how well calibrated is this instrument of introspection for you? If it's well calibrated, the person rests into their knowing that they're being emotionally honest. They're being authentic as a person, and they can rest into, as long as they're being authentic and showing up in an authentic way, then they can feel a sense of self-esteem around that. But if they're picking and choosing what they're going to look at and what they're going to present to other people, then now it's an uncalibrated instrument or an uncalibrated metric, and that will erode self-esteem because the instrument is off and it's giving a false read. And the same thing with extroverted feeling or harmony. If it's only trying to follow social rules, right, and it receives its marching orders from society. Society says, don't wear white after Labor Day. I'm not wearing white after Labor Day. I'm following the rules, right? Or it's only it's using approval from other people as its self-esteem. This is the same thing. It's an uncalibrated tool or metric. And so the tool needs to be calibrated to go, it's actually not what I'm receiving from society in approval or disapproval, or whether or not I'm receiving marching orders, but it's actually me pouring into society, pouring into other people, and then also getting the reciprocity back. It's sort of this connectedness that goes back and forth with energy. And I'm in a good energetic flow, and I can kind of feel sort of like I have a place in all of this, and I have a place in the tribe, and I have good things that I'm doing and I'm receiving. That's a well-calibrated harmony.
So when we talk about self-esteem, extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking, harmony and effectiveness, have a little bit of a challenge. They have an easier metric, like you talked about, but they also have a little bit of a challenge because it's self-esteem, not others' esteem, not metric esteem, not outside system esteem. It's my esteem. And so there's the metric, but also it's usually not attuned from the self outward. It's usually attuned from the outside in. And so it creates a little bit of a challenge, I think, for them. Just like introverted feeling can conflate worth and value, I think the two extroverted judging functions can kind of conflate the outside versus the inside and not know exactly which direction they're facing.
Yes, there's going to be an easier way to read the output, because it's both output. It's a feeling of a relationship to the outside world and a relationship to the inner world, right? Self-esteem it's not just, I think I'm an awesome person and screw everybody else, right? Because that's actually not self-esteem, right? That's we are wired to gain a sense of a higher estimation of ourselves when we're pouring into the system and then receiving feedback that we've done well, right? Like we've become a good person. It's the process of becoming a good person. And then it's the result of being a contributor and then also receiving contribution back. So self-esteem is in some ways kind of almost a bit of a misnomer. It's a holistic esteem. It's an estimation that is both an inner feeling and also an observation of our output, of our results, our impact, really, you could say.
So just like anything, it's the emergent of an entire system running.
Exactly. And so people who use FJs and TJs, extroverted feeling, harmony, extroverted thinking, effectiveness, the advantage is the obvious output.
Yeah.
Right. And not questioning the output, right? Like, did I do a good job? Right. And when you have one of those functions higher up, you have a better read of whether or not you did a good job, right? You have a little bit more certainty around that, but you have less certainty about the process inside, right? Am I being a good person? Do I have what it takes? Am I competent and capable? Do I know my stuff? Yeah. Right. And so that's the part that's a little bit like that's the place of robbing of the esteem. So let's go to the final one, which is TP types.
We didn't forget about you, TP users. So these are ENTPs, INTPs, ESTPs, and ISTPs in the Myers-Briggs system.
Mm-hmm.
They use introverted thinking. This is the opposite of extroverted feeling or harmony.
Mm-hmm.
We've nicknamed this accuracy. It's about internal logical consistency. And it doesn't, unlike extroverted thinking that needs more of a linear progression or sequence to its thought, this is a little more random access. This can pull a lot of information together and a lot of disparate thoughts, searching for that core, logical, consistent thought, like almost that the principle that can't be distilled down anymore. That's its focal point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, irreducible truths.
There you go.
And there's a connection to radical honesty. Now, this can sometimes be conflated with extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is more about candor. Right? Like if something needs to be said, extroverted thinking or effectiveness will say it, right? And so there's a candidness to that function. Introverted thinking or accuracy is less about just candor as it is more about transparency. It's like, let me put all the cards on the table because I want to know all of the information. And if I can show you everything I know and I explain it all to you, not only will now you have all the information as well, but then you can also calibrate me or show me where I'm wrong, or you give me all your information and then I can show you where you might be wrong. And then it's like a sharpening of the saw, right? And so there's a tendency to overshare. There's a tendency to be very transparent. There's a tendency to do a lot of talking, right? And trying to teach people things because there's a sense that the better our information, the higher quality our information, the better we're all going to do. It's very process oriented. So for people who have this as a strength, the sense of certainty is usually in one's thoughts and beliefs. And it's very rare for TP types to doubt their intelligence. It's very rare for them to doubt whether or not they're seeing things accurately. And there's a lot of connection to using precision and competence to gain self-esteem.
That's a key word, competence for TP types.
Yeah, exactly. Skill development, competence, good processes. Whether you're doing that in a cerebral world or in a physical world, it doesn't matter. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for personal progress over time of the self, right? And so the challenge here, though, is that you also have a sense of disconnection from the self. And so you'll see TP types show a lot of certainty and a lot of self-esteem. Their estimation of themselves is quite high whenever it comes to anything that is unrelated to the self, right? Their ability to do things, their skill development, like their ability to teach or to speak or to share skills with others or to walk in and hit that machine with the hammer with just the right angle and boom, now it's working again. Like those are the kinds of things that there's like no question about their quality or who they are. They have high, usually, estimation of their own value when it comes to those kinds of things. They're going to be less certain, though, about their contribution to the world because on the flip side, extroverted feeling or harmony is their place of uncertainty. So do people like me? Do I have society approval? Am I just saying things that everybody hates? Like, am I actually, I want to contribute to the world. I feel best when I contribute, but I have a tendency like, oh, well then I guess I said that thing. And then now the person is breaking up with me over text. And that's just sort of the story of my life. Or, this person, I'm married to somebody and who's just endlessly patient with me, but I have a hard time making friends. And they're the person who makes sure that we have friends, right? Or whatever it is. So contribution to the world, the ability to positively impact a room, the ability to help other people come to a place of, sort of connectedness, or my ability to connect with other people and to say the right thing and the right thing at the right time and to, make the joke that people laugh at as opposed to it's crickets and everybody's looking at me horrified, right? These are the kinds of things that are usually uncertain. And am I in the right relationship? Have I chosen the right people to be in relationship with? There's also a sense of uncertainty around that, right? Like I'm partnered with this person, but like, is this the right call for me? Or I don't know. So that tends to be the thing that undermines TP's self-esteem because the instruments they're using to determine their contribution to the world is usually the thing that they're not sure what they're reading.
Young TPs, young accuracy, introverted thinking users, I've noticed have some insecurity or lack of self-esteem, it's something around, so I'm not a TP, but I'm patterning this. I'm seeing this in those types. It's something around, I don't have competency in this, but I don't, this is young, again, not mature, but I don't want to show that I don't know this or I don't have competency. And to go learn it would demonstrate that to the world. And so I'm going to have some hubris and I'm going to gerrymander how I talk about it, or I'm going to keep putting it on my footing, and I'll come back to what I know, because to go and build the competency is going to show just how competent I was in the first place. And that makes me feel bad. And I think that undermines some self-esteem for TPs, for TI accuracy users. That's a real challenge, especially when you're young, because that willing to go, I'll take the ego hit. I don't know it. I'm going to go learn it and look silly and stupid in the moment while you're learning it. The incompetence on the way to competence. I think that's a big lesson that introverted thinking accuracy users have to learn to feel a sense of self-esteem in their lives, true self-esteem.
Yeah.
And if they don't learn that, they undermine that ability, and then they get later in life and they're like, I have to pretend like I'm more competent than I really am.
Yep. And that's about reputation. Like you said, it's a willingness to look silly. So the uncertainty isn't an introverted thinking or accuracy. I don't know if you noticed, but like if even a young TP, if they're interested in something and they really want to build skill in it, they're very autodidactical.
Yeah.
They'll go just learn it on their own. But if they have to learn a skill in front of an audience, right? Or if their competence or lack of competence is exposed in front of a group of people or somebody that they admire, well, that's actually the extroverted feeling or harmony uncertainty coming up, right? Like what is this person going to think of me? Are they going to not approve of me because I don't already know this? And so that's where that uncertainty in that part undermines their ability to build better self-esteem. Yeah,
and to be fair, I've seen it more in ENTPs and ESTPs than I have ITPs.
Right.
Because that extroverted feeling or harmony is a little more available to them,
right,
to worry about.
Right. Exactly. Yep, you got it. And so that's actually a good way of illustrating how all of this works, which is that our self-esteem is, if it's in an area that we are more certain with, that decision-making or judging function is higher up for us, we have more access to it, that is going to be our primary way of esteeming ourselves. That is going to be our primary survey tool. And if we can let it mature and be calibrated and really tap into it and sit with that piece and see either if we're a judger type, like, my output is good, my result is good, I can lean on that. And if it's not good, right, if I'm an extroverted thinking or effectiveness type and I'm not making progress, well, then I best get on that, right? Or if I don't have good relationships, now I have my marching orders, right? Like I know what I need to be doing. And if there's a vacuum there, then there's going to be general lack of self-esteem, right? Because those are my favorite tools, right? Those are my metrics. So it's important to make sure that those tools are calibrated. For the perceiver types, right? Introverted feeling authenticity or introverted thinking accuracy, it's having a well-calibrated experience of self, right? And either through a connectedness of self, right? Through like really associating with self or disassociating with self, it's being willing to see the whole thing, right? And not pick and choose and not be uncalibrated by only wanting to look at certain things and not other things for whatever reasons, right? Whatever the coping mechanisms are. It's a willingness to see the entire terrain of the inner world and rest into it. Own it, basically, right? If you can own all the dark parts of yourself as well as all the light parts, all the good parts, you can rest into your authenticity. You can feel good about that. You can have good esteem around that. If you can acknowledge all of your competences and incompetences, right? All the things you know and don't know. And if you are keeping your finger on the pulse of the things you're believing and realizing that, well, maybe I don't actually believe that. Maybe that's something that came from someone else and that's not true to me. If you can rest into all that and own it, you will usually have a good sense of self-esteem from your strengths. If you look at this uncertainty, though, the weaknesses, the opposite side, the thing that tends to undermine us, it's not about necessarily getting better at it. Because as we mentioned in the episode about certainty, you're actually never going to let go of that sense of uncertainty. Even if you become really, really good at these parts of who you are, that uncertainty it's the defining factor in it, right? So it's not about getting better at it. It's about making peace with the uncertain messages that come from it and finding ways to understand that the insecurity is a moment. It's just a moment of uncertainty. It's not telling you who you are. It's not telling you how good you are. It's not necessarily giving you high quality messages. It's just a place that you're not sure how to feel about that. And so you have to look for other measurements to subsidize that. When you're looking at yourself in a sense of esteem, let's take, for example, extroverted thinking or effectiveness. Am I making the impact on the outside world I want to make? Am I making gains? Am I progressing? Am I making progress in the outside world and creating a beachhead? Well, if this is your fourth function, right? You're inferior, you're a 3-year-old in the car model, you might never really actually know.
It's all IP types or IFP types. Yeah,
exactly. All the 2 IFP types. You might never actually have a strong statement for this, right? It might never be like, yeah, no, I've done enough. You might never feel like you've done enough. But you have a couple different choices in front of you. When those messages come up, you can either ignore them and shove them to the side. The questions don't go away. They just hang, and there's more distance, but they're still occupying your mental real estate. So shoving them into the shadow doesn't do anything but give them the opportunity to leach your self-esteem into a place you can't even see. So that's the first one. The second one is to become obsessed with a question, right? And spend too much mental real estate obsessing over it, right? And you'll see this with like EFJ types with introverted thinking or accuracy, which is I need to be doing better, right? And this like critical inner, I call it the inner mean girl voice. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It's like an inner mean girl voice, just constantly telling you how terrible you are.
Or it might show up like, I just need one more credential. I need one more degree or some proof that I know this, like a stamp of approval. Right. That'll prove that I know this.
Yes, exactly. Like I need more proof. And it's like this almost a gluttony for credibility. Exactly. Yeah. That's another way you can do it. But unfortunately, it's gluttonous because it never ends. The certainty is what is attempting to be fed, and it is an uncertain place. So those are your first 2 options. Or you have a third option, which is to keep your finger on the pulse of it, recognize it's a place of uncertainty, and ask yourself how you can integrate the message and thank the message for asking you to check in. The place of uncertainty that this is, the mechanism there is to ensure that you don't become overconfident, that you have a little bit of humility available to you, which is everybody loves me. I have all these wonderful relationships. I'm pouring into the world. But then there's a moment where I go, yes, but do I know what I think I know? This isn't intended to undermine the entire system. It's not intended to make you wildly insecure. It's intended to make sure that every once in a while, you don't buy society's messages too much and you have your own mind in there. Mm. It's intended to go, remember, you also should be thinking your own thoughts. You have permission to think your own thoughts. You have the capacity to think outside of what everybody else is thinking. And are you keeping track of that? What's true for you that might not be true for society, right? And it's not intended to go, and you're also really dumb if you don't know what it is immediately, or, like you got to know all your stuff. It's like, make sure you're thinking about this sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. Don't get overconfident just because everybody else loves you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're being, intellectually honest. So make sure you're intellectually honest. And when those voices of uncertainty come up, understand that they're trying to remind you of something important. And then go, okay, am I being intellectually honest? What should I be thinking about, right? Am I as competent as I'm selling myself, right? I'm asserting that I can get the job, but can I do the job, right? And if the answer is yes, then you go, okay, thank you, voice of uncertainty, for reminding me of this. And then I'm going to go back into my life and I can feel confident in it. I can feel a sense of self-esteem because I both am using a metric that makes sense to me, and I'm also listening to one that is ensuring that I have a little bit of humility in there as well.
So we need to wrap up for time's sake because we've gone a long time talking about this, but I don't know if we're going to get back to self-esteem and personality types anytime soon. So I just want to make a comment a little bit based on what you said, where the back seat of our car, the lower functions, our 10-year-old tertiary or 3-year-old inferior, often what we do as people is we reduce our ability in those areas down to our level of competency. So for example, in my life, extroverted thinking or effectiveness is my 10-year-old or tertiary process. I will try to put things onto the terms that I can have good self-esteem in that area, right? Like I want to do things that are more simple effectiveness things or extroverted thinking things. The more complex they are, the more I'm going to feel uncertain and the more I'm going to lack self-esteem with extroverted thinking or effectiveness things. So I'm always trying to gerrymander them onto my turf so I can feel good. Unfortunately, this undermines others and myself because there's so much more that can be done with that I think true self-esteem also is a self-esteem that I'm not as competent as maybe somebody that uses this as a strength.
Right.
Like a TJ user.
Right.
Like an ENTJ. If I say, no, I'm just as good at extroverted thinking effectiveness as you, ENTJ person, come on. Come on. Now, I might be using it in ways they haven't used it. I might have some skill built in certain areas, so maybe there's some of that. But ultimately, I have to esteem myself and say, I'm never going to be as proficient with this part of me as someone that uses this part of me as their strength. And I think that's important to remember because we always want to put it on our terms and then judge ourselves and others by that metric. I don't think that's necessarily fair. And again, we don't have necessarily time to unpack that idea. I just wanted to anchor it into this podcast, capture that idea. I mean, you might want to make a comment just to unpack a little bit. We do need to wrap up, but I wanted to capture that here before I lost that thought.
Yeah.
And we move on to the next series or subject.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I think we've done other podcasts on the concept of modesty and how important modesty is. Modesty is taking an accurate assessment of oneself. And what I think you're effectively saying is there needs to be a measure of accuracy when you're looking at your estimation of yourself. Because our inner wisdom knows when we're lying to ourselves. Like we know when we're pretending and acting as if we're better at something than we actually are.
And that undermines self-esteem.
Exactly.
Totally will undermine it.
Yep. Yeah. And so it's going back to what you mentioned, which was everybody gets a trophy. When everybody gets a trophy, nobody gets a trophy.
Yeah.
And when we're trying to take an accurate estimate, or like when we're trying to esteem ourselves, if we are gerrymandering things in our favor, there's a part of us that goes, you haven't earned this estimation of yourself. Like you might have stated it and you might have decided it and you might believe it, but you don't really, not deep down inside. You don't, well, that's the whole concept of belief and knowing it. You might think it, but you don't know it, right? It's not an inner knowing that you have hit, a proper estimation on the head. And when a house is appraised off from its real value, then you can't sell it. It just sits there. There's no actual, the energy of it just stops, right? There's no forward movement anymore. And the same thing with ourselves. When we esteem ourselves off, right, because of wishful thinking, we know this, right? And it's almost like there's a stuck energy there, right? We know, and it's a heaviness. And now we have to spend more time trying to convince ourselves of this false estimation than we are of just going and doing the things that actually generate more or higher self-esteem. So, and focusing on making ourselves a better version of ourselves, which also increases our estimation of ourselves because we are progressing, we're getting better. So I think that is a really important point. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah. So how do you estimate yourself? You've been listening along. You're the third person in this conversation, but you don't have a microphone. What is coming up for you? Do you have a high estimation of yourself? Do you have a low estimation of yourself? Do you think it's accurate? Do you struggle with this idea of self-esteem? Were you given the message that you are amazing and awesome just how you are, and you've conflated that worth with esteem and value of what you've, I guess, measured in the world, I guess we could say it. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode in the comments. Leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. Stories are compressed experiences. So we can hear your experience in story form and understand a little bit more about you and what's going on from your perspective. I think your voice matters. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We also have a video podcast on YouTube right now. So please head over to YouTube to the Personality Hacker channel, and you can watch us on video doing this podcast And it feels like it's live, right? It feels like it's an intimate experience. So head over and like and subscribe. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and a review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And might I recommend that you head over to personalityhacker.com and look at our suite of programs. I've been encouraging people to pick up a copy of our Tools for Emotional Survival, which talks about how to deal with stress and infusing more joy into your life in an incredibly stress-filled world, particularly right now. Like, it just feels like there's stress everywhere. So how do you up your game? How do you use your personality type to have higher resilience against this stress, and to be able to locate feelings of true joy and decompression in all of this? It's called Tools for Emotional Survival, and we talk about all the personality types in that program, so go check it out.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.